Hello, fellow cyborgs, and welcome to my September reading wrap-up. I'm doing wrap-ups, and it's awesome, and I really like having this extra time to just, read. It's been really nice. Okay, so we're gonna stop blathering right now and get right into the books that I read. The first one I don't actually have a physical copy of because my friend's borrowing it, is Lost Stars by Claudia Gray. This is a Star Wars novel, technically YA. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. This novel is all about humanizing the Empire, and most specifically the individual people that make up the body of the Empire. So this follows 2 childhood friends, Sienna, I think is how you're supposed to say her name, I call her Sienna, and Thane. They both want to be pilots, and they end up joining the Imperial Army, and they end up being pilots. Good for them. I'm glad that their dreams came true. This book spans many of the events that happen in movies, 4, 5, and 6 for sure. I'm trying to think of anything in 3. Nope, 4, 5, and 6, which I thought was really interesting to see events that I knew so well from a completely different perspective. This gets a little bit like angsty YA, but overall, I just loved seeing the more inner workings of the Empire, understanding how the soldiers in the Empire really lived. They have to eat goo mush because wanting real food is a sign of weakness. It's really interesting. I was pretty impressed with Claudia Gray's writing style, and I look forward to reading more Star Wars fiction from her. I have Bloodline on my shelf, so one day, that will be in my brain and I will read it. So this was far more enjoyable than Catalyst, which I read over the summer, which was also a Star Wars book, and I look forward to reading more Star Wars novels in the future. On to the physical books. I picked up Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. I'm not sure if I hauled this because I haven't been hauling things in videos, though I've been hauling things. I picked this up when I was in Reno, Nevada on a weekend sort of little vacation. Why Reno? I don't know. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. I ended up actually borrowing the audiobook from the library and finishing it that way. I love Ray Bradbury, but I was expecting Dandelion Wine to be a novel with an overarching plot, but this ends up being a novel made up of a collection of vignettes that are kind of interlinking and explore the same town, Greentown, Illinois, in the same summer months. But for me, I found that the chapters not necessarily linking right one after another and continuing on the same plot just kind of made my interest drop off a little bit, and it made it really hard for me to remember exactly what happened. That being said, there were still at least 2 moments that did make me cry in bed as I was listening to this while trying to fall asleep. So Bradbury certainly knows how to do his stuff, but I can't give it more than 3 out of 5 stars until I actually pick it up and physically read it and can stay enthralled and know whether or not I love it, because I'm not a super detailed audiobook listener. I do a lot of my listening trying to fall asleep, which means I kind of miss things sometimes. Bradbury is still one of my favorite authors of all time, and I look forward to rereading this in the future and look forward to reading more of his stuff in the very near future, which I'll talk about later, in a month. So look forward to that. Speaking of audiobooks, I also listened to Great Expectations by Charles Dickens on audiobook. I really wanted to read this new beautiful Rhodes Classics edition, but I decided that picking up another heavy classic maybe wouldn't be a good idea, even though it ended up that I became addicted to classics at this point. I probably could have read it. Anyway, I'll read this again in the future. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Simon Preble, and he was awesome. I loved listening to this on audiobook. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, 3 out of 5 stars. I'm awful. I don't remember. When I'm listening to things on audiobook, I find it hard to give it a true rating because I'm not ruminating over things as much. I'm kind of just going with the flow. One of the things I really enjoyed about Great Expectations was all of the morbid imagery that comes up in here. This book starts out in a graveyard. There's a creepy bride woman living in an estate covered in cobwebs with a 20-year-old cake still standing. There's a solicitor / lawyer / barrister, I don't know what it is, with an office that has grease marks on the back wall from convicts putting their back against the wall in fear of him. There's death masks. It's just full of all sorts of creepy stuff, and I really enjoyed reading about it. I also really enjoyed not liking Pip because he's a bit of an a-hole. really. And anyway, so Great Expectations. I will read this physically in the future again. I've read it twice in physical form, once when I was 14 and once when I was like 19. It didn't get along with me very well then, but since I've read a lot more Dickens, and I think I'm coming to appreciate him, so I'm hoping that one day Great Expectations will be just like a wonderful adventure for me. For right now, the audiobook was a lovely way to fall asleep various nights this last month, and I am so glad I have a really pretty edition to read and highlight next time I read. Not highlight, but mark up. Anyway, next is a really kind of odd spur of the moment pick for me. This is The Haunted Mansion, Imagineering a Disney Classic by Jason Sorrell. I purchased this book for my dad a year ago because reasons when we were at Disneyland, and he hasn't read it since, but I decided like a couple weeks ago on a Sunday afternoon that I just had a hankering to learn about the Haunted Mansion. So I sat down and read this in like 2.5 hours or so. There are a lot of pictures, and this was just kind of interesting. It's about how the original Haunted Mansion was developed and eventually came to be a thing in Disneyland, and then it goes into the details of the different iterations of the Haunted Mansion at the different Disney parks, and then finally goes in depth into the ride with all of like some hidden secrets and like, this is where this idea for this room comes up, this is how this room is different in Phantom Manor at Disneyland Paris, and all sorts of fun stuff. This was really interesting, not life-changing. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, but I'm glad I read it, and I might reread it in the future when I need to brush up on my Disney Haunted Mansion facts. This is The Riverbank by Kij Johnson, which was so anticipated by me this year. It's a new release. It came out in September. This is a sequel to Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows. So in preparation, last month I read The Wind in the Willows to prep myself for this. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. It was not my favorite. Unfortunately, this is the lowest rated Kij Johnson that I've read so far. Her other works have received 4 or 5 stars from me. I felt like she was trying way too hard to make this a sequel to The Wind in the Willows and to kind of improve some things in The Wind in the Willows that she found was lacking in the original one, i.e. ladies, and also touching on class issues. But for me, it just didn't really feel like a Kij Johnson. It felt like Kij Johnson trying to be someone else. I also found that some of the characters that we love and know, i.e. Mole, he's very unlike himself in this. This book starts out with new arrivals. 2 lady animals come to the riverbank, one being a lady mole and one being a lady rabbit. And Mr. Mole is just like completely put out by this. He's like completely like, these lady folks are gonna like change things. They're gonna make us like wear ties in the afternoon. It's gonna suck. I just really don't want them to be here. And we don't get an explanation until like the second to last chapter. And that explanation for me was like not okay. And Mole, who's so loving and sweet and loyal in The Wind in the Willows, just became annoying and like, dare I say, sexist. So I didn't like how Kij Johnson played with the characters we knew and love. I appreciated so much that she added ladies into this, but overall, it just did not have as much charm as I expected it to or wanted it to, and as much charm as I see in The Wind in the Willows. Now, The Wind in the Willows isn't for everyone. I've talked about kind of how problematic it is in last month, but anywho, it just was not the sequel I wanted it to be. Maybe I'll get out more of it the next time I read it, but this was a bit of a disappointment. Speaking of a bit of a disappointment, this is Cranford and Other Stories by Elizabeth Gaskell. So I read this whole collection over the course of September. Yes, that's the month that just ended. In here is Cranford, Mr. Harrison's Confessions, The Doom of the Griffiths, Lois the Witch, Curious If True, 6 Weeks at Heppenheim, and Cousin Phyllis. I gave this collection overall 3 stars. There were a couple stories in here that I really didn't like, them principally being Cousin Phyllis and Mr. Harrison's Confessions. Just not for me. I found it kind of boring, and in the case of Mr. Harrison, kind of snotty. Cranford I liked, but just like Dandelion Wine, Cranford's not a true novella or novel with an overarching plot. It's a bunch of interconnected vignettes that over the course of there being many of them, it turns into a more full-length thing. I found that it was kind of unmemorable, but in the moment, really charming, and I would reread it again, but kind of was expecting more of like an overarching thing with memorable character development, but instead it was just kind of episodic, which isn't my favorite. My favorite thing in here was Lois the Witch, not because I enjoyed it, but because I saw what Elizabeth Gaskell was attempting to do, and I think she did it really well. Lois the Witch is an exploration of the Salem witch trials in the late 1600s. It was terrifying and creepy and just really sad how people can, kill other people because of thoughts and frenzy, and it's just insane. It really is insane. I really liked how she fully explored and picked apart the psychology that led to the shitstorm that was the Salem witch trials. So overall, I love, for the most part, Gaskell's novels and longer works, but I'm not so convinced on her shorter works yet. I'm looking forward to seeing more of the 2 weeks of Gaskell that Katie from Books and Things is putting on, and learning more about those shorter fictions, those novellas and novelettes that I need to pick up and try. But yeah, this was not the best. Not the best. Overall 3 stars, but doesn't make me interested in picking up more of Gaskell's short work at this point. And then I read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Well, actually, I finished Rebecca before Cranford and Other Stories. It doesn't matter. I'm going to talk about Rebecca next. I buddy read this with Acacia Ives. She was rereading it and asked me if I wanted to read it with her. And I said, sure, justification to buy another book, but that's fine because I'm going to read it immediately. I really enjoyed Rebecca. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It was incredibly atmospheric. I loved our unnamed narrator and her introverted little ways. I thought she was psychologically complex, and that du Maurier was able to write that just ingeniously. I love du Maurier's writing style. I loved the character of Rebecca and how she slowly comes to life for us as we learn more about her, just as our unnamed character learns more about her. By the way, I named our unnamed character Amaryllis, so she's my Amaryllis now. The only reason why Rebecca didn't get 5 out of 5 stars for me is because it's not a happy book. Do you know what I mean? So sometimes when I put it down and I was going to pick it up again, I knew I would enjoy it as I read it, but I knew it wasn't going to be happy, if that makes sense. I think if I were at a different mindset at the time, this almost got 5 stars, but for me, 4 out of 5 is a commendation enough, and I am so excited to read more du Maurier in the future you don't even know. So if you have any du Maurier recommendations, let me know what's what and what I need to pick up next. I would love to hear it because Rebecca was awesome. And oh my goodness, this was really good. This was really good. The most awesome book that I read in September, however, was Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. I'm just all up on the Gaskell. I've read 4 things by her since July. My goodness. This got 5 out of 5 stars for me. Wives and Daughters is awesome. I loved Wives and Daughters on a similar level as North and South, but for very different reasons. Wives and Daughters is a lot more of a quiet story. It's cozy, it's lovely, it's about characters getting along and not getting along, but not super dramatically. It's steady and stable, and I loved it. These characters were 3-dimensional. Molly and Cynthia and Hyacinth and Mr. Hamley and Osborne and everybody. It was just really awesome to get to know these characters. Also, I buddy read this with the wonderful, amazing Sarai from Sarai Talks Books, and I think that amazing buddy read experience boosted up my enjoyment of this so much, because if I hadn't had to articulate my thoughts and really think about these characters with someone else, I might not have appreciated this as much. This is an unfinished novel. Okay. However, I was very satisfied with the ending. Everything was wrapped up, and for me, I didn't need to see scenes that I knew was going to happen. There's also a cute note at the end from the editor of, I think it's Cornhill magazine, where this was originally serialized in, that kind of wraps up what we would expect to have seen in the X number of pages had she lived to write them, and also just talk about how awesome Gaskell was. There was one line that said of course we don't really mourn the death of the novelist. We mourn the death of a woman who was just so awesome. I don't think he used the word awesome, but Gaskell's awesome in my opinion. So Wives and Daughters, it was just so wonderful. I love it so much, and I love it on a different level of North and South, but they both are 5-star reads. So far, Gaskell is the highlight of my year. So if you're at all interested in a cozy read that's a little bit more of a chunker, but just full of wonderful lifelike characters, I highly recommend you pick up Wives and Daughters. Also a bit of a tangent, but is like a gouge hole in your book very good condition? Because this was another like a book's ridiculousness where you're just like, oh, I mean, the corners aren't bent and the spine looks great, but there's a hole that goes through and pokes through. What's going on? So anywho, those were the books that I read over the month of September. I think it was an exceedingly successful reading month. Let me know how your reading month in September went. Let me know if you have read any of the books that I have mentioned, specifically Rebecca or Wives and Daughters. Let me know if you have any Gaskell or Du Maurier recommendations for me, because more books the better, pretty much. I hope that you had a lovely September. I hope that fall is turning your way soon. And until next time, continue to be lovely.